Welcome back, everyone. And we're diving into a really interesting part of Nehemiah today. Chapters 10 through 13. It's where the Israelites are rebuilding not just the walls of Jerusalem, but their relationship with God. It's like the walls are up, great. Now, what does it actually mean to live in this restored city?
And that's such a crucial point. The physical and the spiritual are so connected. You can't have one without the other. The walls represent safety, sure, but also a renewed sense of like who they are as a people. So rebuilding that relationship with God, that's key for their future, for their community.
Okay, so chapter 10 jumps right into this with what's called the covenant. And it's not just a king or a priest making promises, it's the whole community. Priests, Levites, everyday people, they're all committing to following God's laws.
It shows how deeply important this was to them, this idea that their spiritual well-being, it's tied to their society, to how they live together. And they made some specific promises like observing the Sabbath, supporting the temple, and this one might seem a bit odd to us now, but avoiding intermarriage with other nations.
Yeah, that one definitely stands out. Why was that such a big deal back then?
Well, think about their context. They were surrounded by people with very different beliefs, different ways of life. Intermarriage, it wasn't just about romance, it had huge implications. It could mean adopting foreign gods, losing that unique connection they had with God.
It's like, how do you hold on to your identity when you're constantly being influenced by others? It's something we still grapple with today, right? Cultural groups, religious communities, even online communities, they all deal with this.
Totally. And this desire to protect their identity, it's even clearer in chapter 11, because now they're focused on repopulating Jerusalem. It wasn't just about filling houses. It was about creating a community dedicated to this covenant.
But that meant asking people to uproot their lives, leave their homes, even families to move into the city. It's a huge ask.
And yet people volunteered. That's how important it was to them. A strong Jerusalem wasn't just a nice idea, it was a priority. They understood their individual lives, they were tied to the well-being of the community.
That communal spirit, it really shines in chapter 12 with the dedication of the wall. This isn't just a ceremony, it's a massive celebration, music, sacrifices, pure joy.
Can you imagine being there, seeing all that hard work come to fruition? This wall, it wasn't just bricks and mortar, it represented their resilience, their unity. It was a powerful symbol of their commitment to God and to each other.
This dedication wasn't just a party, it was affirming their identity, their purpose. It's like a reminder that celebrating together, whether it's a holiday or a festival, it reinforces that sense of belonging, those shared values.
But here's where things get interesting. In chapter 13, Nehemiah comes back to Jerusalem after being away for a while. And, well, let's just say he finds that the initial excitement, it's kind of faded.
Oh no, what happened? What did he find?
Well, the honeymoon phase of the covenant renewal, it was over. People had slipped back into old habits, neglecting the temple, violating the Sabbath, and, you guessed it, intermarrying again.
Wow, after all that effort, that's got to be disheartening. Why do you think people went back to those old ways?
Human nature's a funny thing, isn't it? It's easy to make promises when everyone's fired up. But keeping that commitment over time, that's a whole other story. It takes constant work, individually and as a group.
It's like, starting a new diet or exercise routine, all gung-ho, and then life gets in the way. Those old habits sneak back in.
Exactly. And don't forget, they were living among people with very different values. So that influence, plus our natural tendency to drift back to what's familiar, it all played a role.
And I'm guessing Nehemiah being gone didn't help. Like, when the leader's not around, it's easier to let things slide.
It shows how important strong leadership is for keeping those values alive.
So what did Nehemiah do when he saw all this?
He didn't just sit around complaining. Nehemiah, he took action.
Oh, I like him already.
He confronted those who were breaking the covenant, purified the temple, reestablished the Sabbath.
Now that's what I call leadership.
He got it. Upholding the covenant, it wasn't a one-time thing. It was an ongoing process, needing constant attention, sometimes even shaking things up. He was thinking long-term, the community's well-being depended on their faithfulness.
Makes you think about all the challenges we face today, trying to stick to our values, whether it's personally or as a society.
And it's easy to get discouraged when we see bad stuff happening, injustice, apathy, all that. But Nehemiah's story, it reminds us we have a choice. We can either accept things as they are, or we can try to make a difference.
It doesn't have to be some huge project, right? We can all be Nehemiahs in our own way.
Exactly. Even small acts can have a big impact. Speaking up against something wrong, volunteering, even just being kinder to each other.
It's about matching our actions with our beliefs, even when it's hard.
That's it. And that brings us to Nehemiah's prayer in chapter 13, verse 31. He says, Remember me, oh my God, for good.
What a powerful statement. What do you make of that?
It's like a window into his heart. He's asking for God's favor, sure, but it's more than that. It's about wanting to leave a legacy, to make a positive impact on the world.
Like he's asking, what will I be remembered for? That's a question for all of us, isn't it?
It is. Our actions have consequences. They ripple out. They affect others, even future generations.
It's about thinking beyond ourselves, thinking about the kind of mark we want to leave.
Exactly. Aligning our actions with our deepest values, so we're remembered for the good we brought.
I'm feeling inspired, but also a little overwhelmed. Like Nehemiah rebuilt a whole city. I'm just trying to get through the day.
But that's the point. It's not about grand gestures. It's about those small, everyday choices that add up over time.
So how do we do that? How do we be everyday Nehemiahs in the 21st century?
We'll get into that next time. But for now, think about those core themes. Commitment, community, resilience. They're not just for ancient Jerusalem. They're relevant to all of us in everything we do.
So stay tuned for part 2, where we'll explore practical ways to apply these lessons to our own lives. Thanks for joining us.
So we left off with Nehemiah finding things, well, not exactly how he left them, kind of backsliding happening in Jerusalem.
Right. People not quite living up to the covenant they all agreed to. It's kind of like you make this big New Year's resolution, all gung-ho, then February rolls around. Suddenly those cookies are looking really good again.
It's so human, isn't it? They're creatures of habit. Plus, think about the influences around them. They're living next to people with totally different beliefs. It's easy to get pulled back into those old ways.
Yeah, peer pressure is a real thing, even in ancient times. But what I find interesting is how Nehemiah reacts to all this. He doesn't just throw a tantrum or give up.
Exactly. This is where we see his leadership in action. He confronts those who are breaking the covenant, purifies the temple. He even goes so far as to shut the city gates on the Sabbath to prevent violations.
Wow, taking a stand. But isn't that a bit extreme?
Maybe by today's standards, but you got to remember, this was a different time. The Sabbath was central to their identity, to their relationship with God. He saw those violations as undermining everything they'd worked for.
It's like, imagine you spend months building this amazing garden, then someone comes along and tramples all over it. You'd be pretty upset.
Exactly. And Nehemiah, he's not just trying to be a control freak. He genuinely believes that upholding the covenant is vital for their future.
It makes you think about how we approach those moments when our own values are challenged. Do we just stand by and watch, or do we actually do something about it?
It's easy to complain about things, but Nehemiah, he's all about action. He sees a problem, he addresses it head on.
And that's a powerful lesson, right? It's not enough to just believe in something. We have to actually live it out, even when it's hard, even when it means rocking the boat.
It's about putting our values into practice, holding ourselves and others accountable.
So what can we, regular folks in the 21st century, learn from all this? How do we be everyday Nehemiahs?
Well, first, we got to identify what our own covenant is. What are those core values, those principles that we absolutely won't compromise on?
Okay, so let's say we've got those figured out. What's the next step? How do we actually put them into action?
That's where things get really interesting. And that's what we'll explore in part 3 of our deep dive.
Ooh, cliffhanger. All right, everyone, make sure you come back for the conclusion. We'll be getting into the nitty-gritty of how to live out our values in the real world. See you then.
Okay, so we've talked about Nehemiah's commitment, his leadership, his, let's call it proactive approach to problem solving. But how does all this translate to, our everyday lives?
Right, because we're not all ancient city builders facing down enemies and stuff.
Exactly. So how do we take these big ideas and make them, well, smaller, more manageable?
Well, it starts with those core themes we keep coming back to. Commitment, community, resilience. These aren't just ancient concepts. They're like fundamental to human experience.
Okay, I'm following you, but give me an example.
Think about that New Year's resolution you mentioned earlier, the one that fizzled out by February. What if, instead of going big, you focused on one small change, something you could actually stick with?
Okay, like instead of I'm going to work out every day, it's I'll take a walk 3 times a week. Exactly. It's about setting realistic goals and maybe even finding someone to keep you accountable.
Like a workout buddy. Or maybe a friend who's also trying to eat healthier.
Exactly. It's like Nehemiah didn't rebuild Jerusalem alone. He had a whole community working with him.
So community's a big part of this everyday Nehemiah thing, huh?
Absolutely. It's about connecting with others who share your values, who can support you on your journey.
So it's not just about what I do, it's about who I surround myself with.
It's like iron sharpens iron, right? We need each other to stay strong, to keep moving forward.
Which brings us to resilience, because let's face it, life throws curveballs. We're going to mess up, we're going to face setbacks, maybe even do some backsliding of our own.
And that's okay. It's not about being perfect. It's about how we bounce back from those challenges.
So what would Nehemiah say to us in those moments?
He'd probably remind us that he faced plenty of obstacles too, delays, opposition, even betrayal. But he kept going. He didn't let those setbacks define him.
So it's about learning from our mistakes, picking ourselves up, and trying again.
And maybe giving ourselves a little grace along the way.
Right, like we're all works in progress. But it's that commitment to keep growing, to keep striving towards those values that really matters.
And remember, we don't have to do it alone. We have our communities, our faith, even these ancient stories to draw strength from.
So it's like taking that inspiration from Nehemiah, from those who came before us, and using it to build our own legacies, even if they're not, city-sized.
Exactly. It's about finding those everyday ways to live out our values, to make a positive impact, however big or small.
And I think that's a beautiful way to wrap up our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from ancient walls to modern-day challenges, but the message is clear. We all have the power to make a difference. So go out there, be those everyday Nehemiahs, build those legacies, and keep those covenants strong. Thanks for joining us.